Title for today's lecture, The Growing Power of the Presidency. It would make sense to start off, before we talk about specific presidents and the way the president's power has grown over time, to first outline what powers the Constitution specifically gives to the president. It's hard for us to imagine that the president hasn't always been this super powerful figure. But, in fact, early presidents really did very little other than to carry out the powers that they were given by the Constitution. So again, we're used to a very, very powerful president who does a lot. But our earliest presidents really stuck to the Constitution. And they only carried out the powers that they were granted. So, what were those powers? Well, I'm sure you guys are already aware of some of those powers. For example, the Constitution makes the president the commander-in-chief of the U.S. military. It is commander-in-chief, not and, commander-in-chief of the U.S. military. Effectively, what does that mean? Thanks.
Controls the military.
What does that mean?
They're in charge.
He's top dog. Okay. He is, when you look at the chains of command, right, from the lowest private up through generals, at the top of every single chain of command is the President of the United States. Okay. The President is also given, by the Constitution, the power to grant pardons to criminals. What does that mean?
Then they don't serve jail time if they're abstaining from that crime.
Okay, kind of. A pardon is, it's not really the best way to explain it, but in simple terms, it's kind of like a get-out-of-jail-free card. It is a way of excusing someone or forgiving someone for a crime that they did or may have committed. Now, oftentimes, the president's not going to use that to, excuse a hardened criminal, right? But perhaps the best known example was during Watergate. We'll study this in the spring. President Gerald Ford took over when President Richard Nixon was forced to resign. And controversially, one of the first things he did early into his presidency was issue a pardon to President Nixon, right, for any crimes he may have committed during the Watergate cover-up.
How would he have done that?
What do you mean how?
Why?
Why? His rationale was it had kind of consumed the country and become this big national kind of crisis, and it was best for the country if we put it behind us and moved on.
So it's just kind of a way to, say, screw the judicial system, whatever. I mean...
No, not really. Perhaps in a very cynical view. But, it's a power that the president has that he's going to, in theory, exercise a lot of discretion with. Another power that the president is given by the Constitution is the power to call Congress into special session.
So, wait, what was that? Sorry.
The president has the power to call Congress into special session. So if there is, for example, a national emergency or something really important happens that needs action, but Congress is adjourned, it's in recess, and the congressmen are all spread out over the country, the president has the constitutional power to basically command Congress to get its butt back to Washington and work on whatever the problem is. And again, that's something he's going to use discretion with. Okay. The president is given the power to make treaties with foreign nations. Most of the time when we think treaties, what comes to mind? Peace treaties, right? We think war. Treaties are what ends war. Okay? And that's certainly the case, okay? But treaties don't have to be, right? Treaties could be about trade, right? Treaties could be about weapons. So we'll study in the spring, the United States negotiated some treaties with the Soviet Union during the Cold War to try to lower the number of nuclear missiles, called the SALT treaties. The president has the power of appointments, meaning he gets to appoint high-ranking officials.
I think Trump just appointed his attorney general, or selected it.
He selected his chief of staff, which is basically his top aide. So he certainly is going to pick people to be his advisors, right? Can you think of other important positions the president's going to appoint? Supreme Court, right? That was a big one with this election, right? Because there's currently an opening. And with several older justices, there could be more soon. So Supreme Court justices, ambassadors, cabinet officials like the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, the Attorney General. The president has the power to appoint those. For really high-ranking ones, who also gets a say? You remember?
Congress?
Specifically,
Senate.
the Senate. Okay, specifically, the Constitution, the wording is with the advice and consent of the Senate. So the president gets to pick, and then the Senate confirms. Okay, so again, checks and balances. The president, as you guys are well aware, since we just talked about the lawmaking process, has veto power. Meaning he can do what?
Veto a bill.
Which means what?
He doesn't
Kill it.
Okay.
Or
Block it. Most of the time it kills it. Okay? But remember, veto simply means a block. He can block it. It may or may not kill it, because what can Congress do?
override.
Override the veto. Okay? Believe it or not, President Obama has only had one veto overridden. Okay? It's pretty impressive. It's hard to override a veto, right? Because to override it, you got to have 2/3 of both houses of Congress, and that's pretty difficult to do.
Has it ever happened though?
Yeah, just Barack Obama had one just recently get overridden. But you got to think, right? If you're the president and you're vetoing bills, and Congress continually overrides them, right? You're pretty weak, right? So typically, the veto would be used to kill a bill. And the president has the power to execute the laws of the land. The president is given the power to execute the laws of the land. Now that's a pretty vague power. Make sure this thing doesn't go to sleep on me. But put another way, his job, as defined by the Constitution, is simply to carry out the laws that Congress passes. He is the enforcer, so to speak. And that gives the president a lot of discretion as, well, okay, what's the best way to do that? So what we're going to do is kind of take a journey through a few presidents to illustrate the ways that the president's power has grown over time. All right? This is what the Constitution says the president can do. Now we're going to start with George Washington, and we're going to kind of go through and see how has the president's power grown over time, and is that a good thing? So let's start with George Washington. Makes sense to start with Washington. He is, of course, the first president. A quote from Washington. As he took office, one of the things that he said, and again, you don't have to write this quote down, but it's a telling quote. He said, "I walk on untrodden," bless you, "I walk on untrodden ground." Bless you again. "There's scarcely any part of my conduct which may not hereafter be drawn into precedent." As the first president of the United States, George Washington shaped the office, maybe more than anyone else, because everything that he did set a precedent. And it's kind of confusing because it sounds like president, but it's precedent. Everything that Washington did, since he was first, set a precedent for others to follow. So what's another, if we were going to use a synonym for precedent?
Set a bar.
Example. Okay. He set an example. So let me give you some examples. For one, the title that we use to address the president, Washington selected. What do we call the president? Mr. President, right? So there was debate over, well, how should we address the president? Should it be, His Excellency? Should it be His Majesty, right? And he said, no. All that sounds like a king. Mr. President will do, right? So that set an example. Ever since, when we address the president, it's Mr. President. So the title is an example that Washington set. Washington also set the precedent of serving 2 terms. Now the Constitution specifically says you can only serve 2 terms. Okay, but before it didn't. Washington simply said, 2's enough, it's somebody else's turn now. And everybody followed that until FDR. Now it is written into the Constitution. Washington set the precedent of selecting a cabinet of advisors to help him. Washington understood the job was too big and too important for one person to do by himself. So cabinet, again, not a literal cabinet. It's just a word to indicate the president's main advisors. And Washington only had something like 5. Right? He had a Secretary of War and a Secretary of State and a Secretary of the Treasury. Right? He had a fairly small cabinet. It has grown. Right? But those are the president's closest main advisors. And Washington also set the important precedent of using force, if necessary, to enforce the laws. Say that again. Washington set an important example of using force, if necessary, to enforce the laws of Congress. And a great example of that is the Whiskey Rebellion of 1791. I don't care that you know the year. I don't really care even that much that you remember the name Whiskey Rebellion, apart from the fact that it sounds kind of cool. But long story short, if you guys remember, we talked about one of the weaknesses of the Articles was that there was no enforcement mechanism, right? And you had Shays' Rebellion up in Massachusetts, where there was an armed rebellion, and the national government couldn't do anything about it. They were like, well, good luck. Okay. A similar situation happens with some farmers in Pennsylvania who are upset about taxes. They start kind of an uprising, and Washington shuts it down, right? Uses the military to come in and shut it down. Because there's a president now. The president's job is to enforce the rules, and I'm here to do that. And the Whiskey Rebellion very quickly fell apart. So by using that force, George Washington established the presidency as a powerful and respected position. Many of the presidents that followed, really modeled themselves after Washington. The next president that we're going to kind of highlight, however, is the 7th president, Andrew Jackson, and talk about the ways that he sort of molded the presidency. So if you remember, we've talked about voting rights early on. Only about, why is this so hard to get off? Only about 7% or so of the population was actually allowed to vote. But voting rights expanded over time. And as voting rights grew, the president started to become more and more a representative of a larger group of people, right? It was more representative of the American people rather than just the wealthy white elite men. Right? And perhaps no better president embodies that spirit of a representative of the people than Andrew Jackson. Right? He came from a sort of a common background. Okay, was born into a fairly poor family, and grew to positions of importance. Because he came from this common background, Jackson saw himself and really sold himself as the defender of the common man.
So he sold himself, I guess, projected himself when he was running as a person for the
A commoner, right? Yeah, so think about those persuasive techniques we talked about, right? Plain folks. He really promoted himself to the average American as, I'm one of you, right? I'm going to defend you. I'm going to fight for the average American. And so, because he saw himself in this way, Andrew Jackson became the first president to widely use the veto. Up until Andrew Jackson, presidents had used the veto, but earlier presidents would only use a veto when they felt a law was unconstitutional. Early presidents would only use the veto when they felt the law was blatantly unconstitutional. Andrew Jackson became the first president to use the veto to block laws that he simply felt were bad for the average American. Perhaps the most notable example of that was during the fight over the second bank of the United States. And this is a pretty fascinating story, really. You don't need to know all the details. But the Bank of the United States was up for renewal. Right? Basically, its charter had run out, and Congress voted to renew its charter. And there was absolutely nothing unconstitutional about it. But Andrew Jackson blocked it. Quite controversially, blocked the Bank of the United States, effectively killed the second bank of the U.S., simply because he felt that it benefited the rich at the expense of the common American. And so that's a great example of how he would use the power of his office not just to block unconstitutional laws, but to block laws he felt were bad for the common man.
So he blocked the American bank.
The Bank of the United States.
Oh, bank.
There's a second one though.
Doesn't really matter that much. But it's a great example. He felt this bank is designed to benefit the wealthy. It's designed to benefit the elite. There's nothing unconstitutional about it, but I don't like it because it's bad for the average American, and therefore, veto. And that was really a way to vary and sort of veer off from the path that earlier presidents had took. And ever since Andrew Jackson's administration, presidents have much more widely used the veto power. So if we want to see, trace back the presidents using the veto power, we trace that back to Andrew Jackson. He really established it as a regular feature of the presidency. Not only if a bill's unconstitutional, but if the president disagrees with it, if he thinks it's bad. Following Andrew Jackson, there's a series of presidents who, some decent, some really horrible. The presidency really kind of just sort of dips down a little bit, I think, until you hit the major crisis of the mid-1800s, the Civil War. So obviously, if we're going to be talking about the power of the presidency and how it's grown, no conversation like that would be complete without talking about Abraham Lincoln. The very nature of the time demanded a strong leader in the White House. The presidents prior to Lincoln failed miserably in that regard. right? They mostly sat there and said, well, all I can really do is enforce Congress's laws, and there's nothing I can really do about the whole slavery thing, and so I'll just kind of sit here while the country falls apart. Lincoln comes in, and he knows he's got to be a strong leader, and he delivered in that regard. Lincoln greatly expanded on what it means to execute the laws of Congress.
On Congress or of Congress?
To execute the laws of Congress. I mentioned in that first part of the lecture, right? Faithfully execute the laws. That's pretty vague. Kind of leaves a lot of wiggle room. And Lincoln took that wiggle room and ran with it. So that gives me a lot of power, and I'm going to use it because the country's falling apart. Okay? So he took that power and really expanded it. He took actions, sometimes without even waiting for approval from Congress. For example, Lincoln declared martial law in Maryland during the Civil War. Martial law means that basically the government is suspended and the military is put in charge.
In Maryland?
In Maryland. Lincoln suspended the writ of habeas corpus during the Civil War. Suspended habeas corpus. Habeas corpus basically means that if you arrest someone, you have to charge them with a crime or you have to let them go. He suspended it, basically meaning we're in a time of war and we can arrest you and hold you indefinitely without having to give you a trial.
Isn't that a little harsh?
Yes, it is. It's flatly unconstitutional, too. Right? And the Supreme Court came back later and said that it's a period of civil war. Right? Lincoln simply didn't care. Right? He needed a strong leader. He said, I am the president. It is my job to defend the Constitution of the United States, and these are the steps I need to take to do that in perhaps the greatest crisis our country has faced.
Do you think that's why he was murdered?
I think he was murdered because he freed the slaves.
He issued the Emancipation Proclamation. By executive order. All of these actions he took without getting approval from Congress. So all of these things together, yes, a little cold here, all these things together show how Lincoln demonstrated that during periods of war or crisis, the president's powers can be greatly expanded. So we have two more presidents we're going to talk about.
Two? Oh, yeah.
Two more presidents we're going to talk about, kind of briefly here. And then we'll finish up by discussing the imperial presidency. We only got about 5 more minutes, so I'm going to move through these last couple kind of quickly. But remember, if it's a little thin, just go back and watch the last couple minutes of the video when I post it, and you can flesh it out a little bit more. So, for about the next half century, presidents, just kind of act a lot like kind of clerks. Until we get to Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt adds another layer to the power of the presidency, primarily because Roosevelt is the first president to use the office to really shape public opinion. We're so used to it now, but presidents haven't always been the main shaper of the news, right? The presidents haven't always gone around giving major speeches, right? And trying to influence public opinion. Teddy Roosevelt, really was the first to try to shape that through speeches, through holding daily meetings with reporters. The president does that frequently now, not necessarily daily, but he would hold meetings with reporters. The second thing Roosevelt did, first really using the office to shape public opinion, the second major thing he did was he greatly expanded the executive branch. He created a lot of new agencies that became part of the executive branch. And that brings us to Teddy Roosevelt's cousin, Franklin. Not his son, it's not his brother, it's his cousin. Franklin Roosevelt, FDR, built on Teddy Roosevelt's example, really turned the presidency into what we know it as today. He really expanded on the president's use of emergency powers to handle crisis. First, the Great Depression. Later, World War II. And he really reached out directly to the American people through his famous fireside chats. These were radio addresses where he would talk directly to the American people to win them over. And ever since that, we've been very used to a powerful president who communicates frequently with the American people. Which leads to the last part of the lecture. And again, I'm going to do it kind of quickly, so go back and rewatch part of the video if you need to. The imperial presidency. Just because we have a powerful president doesn't mean that everybody's wild about it, right? The modern president is way more powerful than the framers of the Constitution imagined. So it leads to two main arguments. One, some argue that he's gotten too powerful and acts more like a king or an emperor, and that's bad. Right? That's where the term imperial presidency, right? Imperial emperor. Some argue that the president's too powerful and he acts more like an emperor. The flip side of that argument is that we should have a powerful president. A powerful president can do more to defend and protect the American people. Plus, his powers are still limited by the Constitution. What's the right answer? I don't know, right? That's an opinion. I will post the video, all right? So I know I kind of rushed through the last bit there. Come see me if you want to go over it, but you can also go back and check the video as well.